Thank you for joining us here tonight, and we're going to participate in a conversation about future of cities, smart cities, and take an examination at Seattle's position at the forefront of balancing technology, data, and social values. But before we look into the future, I think it's important to look back and recognize the past. The Seattle Architecture Foundation acknowledges that we are on the traditional land of the Duwamish and Suquamish people, a people forced to relocate, but who have persevered and continually contribute to the place that we call home. The Seattle Architecture Foundation views the history of Seattle to include from time immemorial to today, and we're committed to exploring that through partnerships in our programs. We are in the space that we like to call the Center for Architecture and Design, and we call that because it houses several organizations: Seattle Architecture Foundation, AIA Seattle, AIA Washington Council, and Design in Public. Seattle Architecture Foundation is a nonprofit, and our mission is to connect the people to the architecture, design, and history of Seattle. And we are so lucky to get to share this dynamic space with our other organizations because we get to promote exhibits, programs, and have conversations about design's role in shaping cities. And we couldn't do that without support from our sponsors on the front wall there, and these guys. Oop, jump the slide. There we go. So yes, we, being a nonprofit, we do thank everyone who has supported the Seattle Architecture Foundation. And I think it's also really important to call out that this is a design in-depth panel discussion, and it is brought to you free of charge because of our awesome volunteers. I see a couple of you. Raise your hands. Maria? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, because of them, we can all be here together free of charge and enjoy. Anyway, but to get to the point of tonight, we are here to focus on how emerging technologies can create livable, equitable, and sustainable cities. And so to get things started, please help me by welcoming our moderator, Cheryl Kababa, Vice President of Strategy at Substantial and a former Executive Creative Director at Seattle-based design consultancy Artifact.
Great. I think we have a little clicker here. We're all just going to introduce ourselves so you know who we are. I am not an architect, but I'm a designer. Is the thing working? How about I just stand here? Oh, does it need to be turned on? Yes, I design and work in the technology space. So each of our panelists will have a chance to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work and essentially why they're here and why they can speak at length about the topic for tonight. So a little bit about myself. I'm the VP of Strategy at Substantial. I'm also a board member on Design in Public, which organizes the Seattle Design Festival. And one of the things that's been top of mind for me is, and I think this cartoon expresses it pretty well, is oftentimes I find design used in relation to business in a way that is basically supporting ideas that aren't really outcomes focused. And so the big question in my work is how might we as designers consider the systemic impact of our work, not just how people directly are using our products, services, and spaces, but orient around people who might be affected by the things that we're designing, even if they're not our primary user. What that's meant is that I've been part of kind of developing basically tools and methods that designers can use to think about the consequences of our work, both intended and unintended, and to anticipate unintended consequences. So one of the things that I worked on when I was at Artifact were the Tarot Cards of Tech, which are a series of prompts that designers can use in order to think about what happens to products and services at scale and design work at scale. And I also have been working on making systems thinking part of the design and user experience design practice. Shout out to the educators in the room. I'm also an educator. I think that's the way to kind of like change the nature of our practice. And some of the things that I do is teach workshops around systems thinking, as well as lecture at the University of Washington Human-Centered Design and Engineering program. In terms of like the outputs of some of the things that I've worked on, I really encourage designers to engage in systems mapping, because that allows us to kind of think about the causal loops that basically result in cascading effects of the decisions we're making. So this one particularly, don't feel like you need to read any of it, is around the impact of social media on basically individuals, communities, and society. So if you're curious about the work that I've engaged in, you can find me on Twitter at Cheryl Kababa, and then I also do some writing on Medium. And now I'm going to hand it over to Lyle.
I'm Lyle Bicknell. I'm Principal Urban Designer at the City of Seattle. I have just one slide because I have just one project. A project that has consumed over 20 years. My job description is no more and no less than to promote urban design excellence in Seattle's public realm. Let me start with the observation that most of my day job, the majority of my day job, is fixing the mistakes of the 20th century. Taking down the viaduct, lidding over expressways, freeways, putting back the streetcar system. And here's the thing of it. Most of those mistakes were the result of ideas that were considered brilliant at the time. That gives you some pause, and it also gives you a certain amount of skepticism when people in the 21st century come forth with brilliant ideas. So for this evening's conversation, I'm going to be something of the skeptic, the friendly skeptic, but the skeptic nevertheless. Now I should point out that nothing that I'm discussing, or certainly my opinions this evening, are necessarily plans or policies of the city of Seattle, and I hope you quote me on nothing that I say. But I'm also hoping that by bringing a level of skepticism and questioning as we explore where we want to go in the 21st century, we can benefit from lessons learned from the 20th.
Good evening. My name is Joel. Hello. Glad you're here. I'm a designer, but also design for me is more than a process or an outcome or anything like that. It really is a way of knowing the world. And for me, design has become a way of making the unknown known. And so it's really kind of an orientation towards reality. And so for me, design has looked like mostly this. It's been a lot of research, a lot of design strategy, a lot of futures thinking. Thematically, I've always worked in a design space, but for the majority of my career, I've been maybe what you would call traditionally, innovation consulting, things of that sort. And so a lot of my work has to do with thinking about, what's next, what's on the horizon, what's coming forward. And so tonight I thought I'd just share a few things that I've been thinking about. But I should tell you first a little bit more about me. I currently work for Gensler, a global design firm. We design just about everything, primarily built environment, architecture, that sort of stuff. Previously, spent a couple years in the Mayor's Office of Policy and Innovation, leading civic design efforts there, really tackling kind of urban scale, wicked problems around issues of social injustice, racism, education, equitable access to resources, homelessness, that sort of stuff. But the last few years at Gensler, I've been thinking about these things. I've been thinking about the notion of search and search heuristics and how our relationship to knowledge and information has been radically inverted in the last 20 years. We've essentially outsourced retention, right? Knowledge and information now exist in bytes and bits out there in the ether. It's on the servers, it's in the cloud. And we access it, right, on demand when we need it and apply it in real time. So the ways in which we curate, metabolize, and apply information have radically shifted. And this is, I think, going to have a much more significant impact on society, how we think about the world around us, how we interact with each other. And I think especially starts, this is much more speculative, but when we start thinking about augmented reality overlays on the urban environment, more virtual environments, how we're accessing certain spaces and information within the built environment, how do these search heuristics, now that we've become ingrained in the way that we operate and show up in the world, begin to manifest themselves? Loneliness is something that I'm sure most of you have seen all the headlines in the last 5 years. This is another big thing. The issue with loneliness is that 82% of us live in urban centers in the United States, which means that loneliness isn't actually an issue of proximity, right? So what is it? Well, there's been a lot of conversation among sociologists and other researchers in recent years. And one of the things that they're beginning to point to is that we've essentially lost our capacity for solitude and presence. So the muscle, that ability to just be present and give our attention to one singular thing or even a singular person, has completely atrophied. And people are calling this ambiguous loss, right? That we've lost this sense of presence, and we don't know how to be with ourselves, therefore we don't know how to be with others. And how is technology perpetuating this? How is it reinforcing this? Well, at the same time, connecting us in more intimate ways than it ever has, right? So I think loneliness as a phenomenon is actually an indicator of something much deeper happening in society. So then the question becomes, well, how do we think about this at an urban scale? How are we designing public spaces? How are we designing engagement and interactions? How are we thinking about the way that we program private space versus public space? Where's the thresholds? How do those exist, right? Everything from residential to workspace. So there's a lot of implications here, and that's been a really interesting notion for me. The notion of value has radically changed in the last 20 years. I think we've gone from a industrial to a post-industrial to a post-post-industrial, right, in the last 25 years. Notions of efficiency and optimization are no longer sufficient for competitive advantage and sustained value creation. And as Cheryl was alluding to earlier, this kind of extrapolationist assumption around what it means to create value, that we can take a natural resource and convert it into something that can be used. I think that idea is radically changing as more and more people, especially the design community, are thinking about the ethical, cultural, and social ramifications of our work. And so what does it mean then to create value beyond just quadruple bottom line, et cetera, et cetera. And then the metaverse. I think this is again more speculative, but this is really interesting to me, especially as in the world of architecture, especially BIM has become such a huge thing in the last 20 years. But then digital twin, right? That's like the rage right now. Digital twin, everything. But then think about how that continues to move and snowball down the road, especially as the digital avatar technology is developing at a really accelerated pace. Virtual environments in general. When we start to think about, there's companies that are out there right now taking, basically creating virtual dimensional maps of urban centers. What happens 10 years from now when we live half of our lives in the physical world and then half of our lives in the virtual replica of that world? And what kinds of spaces are we creating there that are exclusive, that are redlined, that are inaccessible, that continue to perpetuate inequality and other injustices? So these are big questions. It's a big space, but these are the things that have been preoccupying me for the last few years as I've been working at Ginza. So yeah, very excited for this conversation tonight.
I'm Anastasia Krasnoslobodtseva, let me turn to you for a second. I know that we have lumped together all the architects, contractors, engineers, but it's very different animals. So let's do architects. Who are the architects in the room? All right, so about half of you, and who are the engineers in the room? Another half, and the contractors? Okay, I'm the contractor, you got me. All right, so this is awesome. Thank you for being here. Till today, have you realized how much power you have in how much data and how much power you have for the owners? So turn to the person to the left and ask, do you know how much power you have for the owners when you're on the design side and construction side? Yeah? So who knows, in the show of hands, how much power in the data of the design process that you have for the owners? One person? Two people in this room? Come on. So I work for Microsoft. It's for a real estate and security organization. It's a group that supports the work that we're doing for our engineers. So engineers that work in Microsoft, human resources, all the other finance, we design, work, innovate for spaces for them. It really is a developer group within Microsoft because we have 103 buildings in Puget Sound, 195 in Americas, EMEA, and most of our square footage is here in Puget Sound. Actually, half of our portfolio, full-fledged Class A office buildings, are in Puget Sound. So I'm sure some of you maybe in the room have worked with us as a client. And this is what our organization looks like. I love bubbles of PowerPoint. It comes with a Microsoft job description. So so real estate and operations is a big part of our group. This is where we need your data. That's where data that you have designed for us, buildings equal data, the square footage that you give us, and how we manage it, that goes into our building operations. Then security operations, that's another important factor. Where's all our security cameras are? How do we manage a fleet of vehicles? How do we manage physical security of our buildings? That's very important to us as well. Global shared services is a underlying service for across our organization. Business operations is everything to do with finance and budget, and then Center of Innovation is where I come from. And so we look across our organization and see what can we innovate. What is the advantage that we can take from the as-built submittals that we receive from architects and contractors? How can we understand operations of our buildings better, and so on, and innovate on that and make operations better. So as we move, as a lot of you know here, what smart buildings are, it is command and control of HVAC systems, building control systems, acoustical systems through a central point of technology. So if you look at weather forecasting, meeting load schedule, historic building occupancy, exterior quality, vehicle traffic patterns. So how do we bring all that data together, which is part live, that is live data. Then we also have static data that comes from BIM models that we receive. And augmenting those two together gives us more holistic understanding of what kind of real estate we have. So that is the foundation of digital twin. That's why I asked you earlier to turn to your neighbor and say, do you realize how much power I have? So what you have in this room is 1/2 of data about our operational portfolio. We get the other half from live sensors, from weather, from historic building occupancy, and so on. But you hold the half. And then from that on, we can have insightful process. So it's no longer just a command and control. We have the insights. So if we can overlay vehicle traffic pattern with weather forecast, we know that if it's going to rain in Seattle, that the traffic is going to slow down. So that's one of the examples there. And then understanding of, okay, if the weather is going to be a certain way, then what is our traffic going to be? What is the meeting load is going to be? Then is everybody going to be late for a meeting, for example? And then we'll tie it together to heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and other building controls. Then we can have more holistic understanding of our building, control and command of our portfolio. So then it's diagram to show you that we're moving away from, we know that we have the physical space, we also now have the digital space, and we are leaning towards intelligent space. So understanding that maybe a building one day can self-control and self-heal, self-respond to emergencies. I was given a warning, so I will rush through. We have why now? Why smart buildings? All these technologies are knocking on our door. We have artificial intelligence. We want to have proactive maintenance. We want to enhance productivity of our employees. We need to be predictable when it comes to building operations. And of course, cloud computing. We did a sample project in Singapore. I think I'm standing under something. And there we had the following data sensors that were live connecting into our digital twin solution, understanding how can we leverage Azure Cloud to create real-time visualization of building energy. We had photo sensors to connect natural lighting with artificial lighting to take the biggest advantage there. And of course, public transit, something that is very relevant to urban design conversation. How do we connect all the options of public transportation, ride sharing, bicycle sharing to create a sustainable commute?
Well, thanks, everyone. So I think we already have kind of like diverse points of view in terms of what does it mean for emerging technologies to create livable, equitable, and sustainable cities. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of a conversation first and then take questions from the audience if that makes sense for you, rather than kind of taking questions throughout, if that makes sense. So I thought it was really interesting, Lyle, I'm going to start with you, that you said most of your job is correcting basically the mistakes of the 20th century. So if we were to think of ourselves at the point at which you are now, in a few decades' time, what do you think are the mistakes that we might be making now?
I would suggest that in many respects we're already there. Let me just give you one example. ITS, Intelligent Transportation Systems. Doesn't that sound great? And I'm going to draw from an example from a city that will remain nameless because I'd like to keep my day job. But there was a city that put a ton of money into this ITS system because it had arterials that were constantly backing up. And this system promised to integrate all of your transportation systems and would do away with congestion, horrible congestion. So they installed this system at great expense, and you know what? It worked beautifully. There was a major backup on one of this really problem corridor, and they pushed the button and the algorithms kicked in, and traffic disappeared, which is a great success by at least by the measures of this conversation. And it involved very sophisticated tracking and algorithms and computers and the cloud and all that. Well, it turned out the way it achieved that miraculous vanishing of congestion was it just froze all crossings of the arterial for pedestrians. So pedestrians waited 5, 6, 7 minutes. They're waiting that 5, 6, 7 minutes in the rain, in the dark, in the wind. All the while this autonomous voice is shouting, wait, wait, wait at them. And if you're a cyclist, the sensors weren't sophisticated enough even to sense you, so you waited forever. So here are the people doing the most important environmental activity on Earth, which is they're moving about by bike, by pedestrians, they're living close to where they work or live. And yet, this system has destroyed their lives. I mean, it's a dystopian system. Whereas people who are commuting by car alone are whisked through, congestion is gone. So I am I would be very careful in terms of how we measure these systems, as sophisticated as they are, that we don't forget some of the unintended consequences. I would posit to you that artificial intelligence is to intelligence what artificial sweetener is to sweetness. Close, but at least for now, consistently disappointing.
Anything to add?
I have to say something. Okay, artificial intelligence absolutely has a way to go a little further, as we all know. But we also have to start absolutely taking advantage of data systems that we already have with machine learning and artificial intelligence. I give you an example. Just yesterday, there's a man digging a ditch next to my apartment trying to fix a leak, and with the shovel. And I look at him from my second floor apartment, and wow, what a waste of cognitive ability. Think about it. If we can have machines dig ditches and men and women think and apply our intelligence for other things that solve problems, that write poetry, maybe he writes novels instead of digging a ditch. That would be a way better world. And if we can leverage that, if we can have a filter of processing power, that if we can leverage computers for what they're good at, and if we can leverage humans for what we're good at, I think it will be a perfect world. And we're trying to approach there. I'm not saying that we're there, and we're trying and saying something that, oh yeah, this system failed. Okay, it failed. We learned something from it. Let's move on and do something better next time.
15 seconds. I want to make sure I don't come across as a Luddite. You're absolutely right. The opportunity to use and empower information to make our lives better, to reduce drudgery, is incredibly potent. But my cautionary theme, which will run through the entire evening, is be particularly cognizant of unintended consequences.
It's like a bias, right? It exists. A cognitive bias or artificial intelligence bias, we always have to be aware of its existence. We have to be mindful of the bias that we have. We built it into our artificial intelligence system. So AI for good is one of the topics that may be discussed here. We talked about how technology has to be leaning towards equitable delivery, equitable real estate development, equitable cities. How do we make sure that we don't build in bias into our personal bias into artificial intelligence systems that we are creating? That's a good question to ask, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think one thing that oftentimes when I hear examples like that where the system prioritized the motorized vehicles over pedestrians and bikes, could it have actually worked the other way and prioritized the right thing? Anastasia is absolutely right in that as long as we acknowledge that artificial systems are a reflection of the bias of its creators, right? And so if we understand that, for example, transportation systems that are oriented around cars is maybe not what we want in terms of actual outcomes or impact in our cities, then it could be that facilitated the opposite, which could have backed up traffic even for, obviously that could have an impact on would it make sense to even travel by car then, if that were the case?
But then on the flip side, if you have intelligent system, I have to speak with on the flip side, if you have intelligent system, how many of you stood at the red light and there was no cars around, no pedestrians, you're just standing there at the red light? Yeah? How many? How many of you drove through the light? Nobody's around. Is there a camera? Oh no, you won't be able to do that soon. But that's the intelligence that we can start building into our systems. If there's no other cars, no other pedestrians, Maybe there's a sensor on the red light that now speeds up the system. It doesn't have to prioritize one over the other, but built-in efficiencies like that can be found in urban.
Do you think we need to have this actually makes me think of, so I used to live in the Netherlands, and I realized, it took me a couple of years of living there, where I was like, there are no stop signs here. There are no traffic lights. And essentially all there are is like yield signs sometimes and sometimes not. And so what ends up happening is people organically have to make conscious decisions about where they're traveling and whether they'll create a collision or not. And so is some of what we're talking about actually an overdependence on basically artificial intelligence when perhaps there are human behavioral solutions to those things? Sorry, Joel, I kept cutting you off.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. I love that. I think that the systems that we build and implement, especially at an urban scale, are a direct reflection of our beliefs about human nature.
Yes.
So there's that. Biases. Right. I think there's two other things that this conversation made me think about. One is just our expectations for this kind of technology and the expectations that we hold for implementation. I think in a world of accelerated change, we need to step back and reconsider our expectations. And I think that the more informed we become, the more conscious we are, those expectations might shift, right? So the expectation from technological feasibility to commuter equity. Like there's a shifting expectation there. So maybe we say we're going to prioritize commuter equity over technological feasibility. And what that might mean is that in the implementation of this work, we can't expect perfection off the bat. And that moving forward, maybe we can't ever again expect perfection. Maybe what we have to come to terms with and expect is learning. That all of this, right, the urban infrastructure becomes a learning platform, and that we have to constantly calibrate and constantly retool and constantly rethink based on what we're learning and based on shifting expectations and based on kind of an constantly evolving social contract that we have with each other. And so I think that there's something there. I'm not sure quite what it is exactly, but I think there's something around how our expectations shape our understanding of how things work. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So that kind of that's like a really nice lead in into like something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of, I do a lot of like work in sort of data privacy, and I'm curious about what does that mean to have a learning environment that is not just people-oriented, but also computational. How do we actually keep consent at the forefront of that? I think one reason I've been thinking about this is because of the Sidewalk Labs situation in Toronto. I don't know, are you all familiar with Sidewalk Labs? So Sidewalk Labs is a Google project that is in partnership with the city of Toronto, and there's been a lot of blowback by citizens, by the Canadian equivalent of the ACLU, basically kind of talking about how this is an area that's going to be collecting tons and tons of data on people. It's involving facial recognition, it's involving monitoring of patterns of movement. It's sort of like, essentially, if you enter this space, you're going to have to acknowledge that your data is being collected. And there's been a lot of blowback from the community about what that means, especially because it's not just their city they're talking about, it's partnering with a private entity, and they're still pretty unsure about what will Google do with this data. And so I think there's a couple of thoughts there that I'm curious about all of your opinions on, which is one, how are we feeling about public-private partnerships? do we feel like this is the trajectory we want to be on? It feels like the private entities are really encroaching on both our public spaces and in collaboration with our public entities. And then secondly, if we want to be sort of smart about how we design our cities and having the ability to use computational data, how do we keep consent and fairness at the forefront of that?
Well, there's two schools of thought on that. We discussed it earlier. One is treating data as absolute human right. You are born and your privacy is your right. And then I don't know if it's such a flip side or a gray area or a personal choice. Others might treat their personal data as currency. So you can say, oh, in exchange for my date of birth, I want to be able to get safety. Or in exchange for my social security number, I want to be able to do banking online. And I think it's a personal choice. There's some laws around it that each society has their own reflection on it. We all know about GDPR in Europe, that how it's treated as absolutely as a right, that it's a stance that a whole group of countries took. I think we're leaning in that direction as well. Certainly at Microsoft, we're looking at it as a right. There's certain applications that are already in the works, like for example, Face ID on your phones, or Windows Hello. When you open, you can access your computer, log in, and so instead of typing in a password and log in and so on. That is fantastic because that is a big shortcut. It's a huge security advantage for you. On the other side is the data is hosted on your personal device. If you start to switch that and have a larger point of view and say, okay, maybe I want to be able to access my house, okay, you still have the data, that's still your personal facial recognition there. Then if you start to scale it, okay, can I access my workplace with that? Can that act as a key to my office with multiple people? Then the line starts to blur and you start to realize, oh, okay, I no longer host my personal facial recognition data about myself. Somebody else has it, who might get their hands on. So then if I extend that definition to further, for example, traveling and airports, imagine being able to walk into the airport, not have to have a security check, and walk on the plane in 15 minutes. Who here would like that? Yes, half of you would, but how many of you don't want to have TSA, that is your face and your personal imprint, about the other half? So that's a quick show of hands, and that gives us where this discussion of data privacy can be taken in so many ways, and a decision is up to us. And
Sorry, good?
Can I ask a related question really quick? How many of you use Google Maps? How many of you have location turned on? So one thing we can consider is, like, are you already treating your data as transactional? I mean, we're basically building collective patterns of where we are at any given time, right? And so I'm curious about the cognizant decision of, like Kara Swisher has described us in the States as like a cheap date when it comes to our data, because we're like, oh, I get to use this like maps, I get to use this map and it's amazing, and it gets me where I need to go, but we aren't totally conscious of like what we're giving up in exchange for that.
That's why you should start using Bing Maps.
A couple of thoughts on this. And I'm not going to stand by some of these statements. I'm just going to throw them out there anyways.
Say it with confidence.
I think that the data privacy conversation has to be deconstructed a bit. It's not a black and white issue. There are very complicated problems with data privacy, but there's also very complex problems with data privacy. Complicated problems can be solved. Complexity can't, right? It's going to be managed. There's obviously a lot of paradox in the data privacy conversation, as you just highlighted, right, with the airline security issue. I don't know if we're going to make progress in the data privacy conversation until a few things. One, we start to recognize what's complicated and what versus what's complex. And we're willing to step into paradox and actually hold two things to be true at once and are comfortable with that discomfort. And I think that's going to require a lot, socially speaking, and then all the way down to kind of the smaller scale. Here's the things I may not stand by, but I think I'm right. You've heard, data is the new oil. We've heard that. Most of us heard that. I would say actually data is what land was 150 years ago. And that surveillance capitalism is the new colonialism. And the decisions that we make today about the ways that the rights that we have to data are essentially going to be the foundation of how we think about society at large for the next few hundred years. The relationships that we have to each other, the relationships that we have to our tools, the relationships that we have to our places are going to be really defined by that. If that's the case, then you could even go as far to say that maybe the data mongers of our economy and society today are the East India Trading Company of modern times, right? And so I think we have to take a really acute look at these issues within a broader historical context and understand the parallels so that we know what's at stake. And it's not something that we can just be really myopic about and think about within the context of modern technology, but we need to look at the patterns over time of how corporations have essentially taken advantage of people and leveraged certain definitions of value and currency. Privacy is a currency today. Data is a currency today. We exchange it in return for services and products. So what does that mean for us? How do we think about that? How do we deconstruct that? How do we bifurcate things into complex and complicated? How do we step into paradox? How do we venture into ambiguity? I think those are the things that we have to come to terms with. So we need to have a way of doing that, mechanisms for doing that. And I think that more civic forums like this are really critical and important to that. I think public-private partnership actually, when done well, can be a really great path towards that. I think it needs to be public-directed, private-informed, not the other way around. So those are the things. I don't think we're going to solve this right now, but it is. But there are ways of approaching it that I think are really critical. So I'll leave it at that.
I was giving a tour of Seattle to a visitor from the UK, and he was absolutely startled that we don't have public surveillance cameras as they do pretty much everywhere. If you've been to Great Britain, CCTV is ubiquitous there. Which of course is surprising because this is the country that brought us George Orwell, but they have adapted and adopted surveillance cameras everywhere. The City of Seattle, by policy, does not allow public surveillance cameras. We do, in the case of school speed zones, we'll have cameras there. But as public policy, we're quite deliberate in not having general surveillance. I think that just speaks to the notion that these things need to be very deliberate. They need to be a part of public policy. They need to come from somewhere. Otherwise, we just kind of slowly drift into them, and without being attentive or even aware, suddenly our data, our movements, our privacy is gone.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on, so Shoshana Zuboff is a Harvard professor who coined the term surveillance capitalism. One that she talks about is what she calls the complexity gap. And the complexity gap is the rate of change within technology, how that change then implicates and perpetuates new human behaviors and expectations, and then the ability of institutions to adapt and support those expectations. And basically it's getting farther and farther apart, right? And so institutions like government, and I think this is where the private partnership conversation gets interesting. Institutions like government are often entrenched in bureaucracy and red tape and procurement and spending and all the mechanisms. They can't keep up with the rate of change. So how do we better partner and kind of help close some of that complexity gap so that we can continue to rely on public institutions to really be that backbone for our approach to things like civic design and urban development?
You say government is not able to keep up with the rate of change like it's a bad thing. I would argue that actually there is a little benefit, maybe not a huge benefit.
No,
I certainly don't want to be a defender of bureaucratic inertia, but I think having government running a little bit behind, for example, I think the obvious one is voting electronically. There is great argument that that would be much more efficient, would perhaps allow more people to be part of the process, but we have seen in many instances, and I suspect if we were to go full on there'd be much more abuse.
Right.
And so having government perhaps be a little bit the slower adopter, there may be situations where that's actually important.
100%.
Now, you don't want to be the Luddite that slows down creativity, but I think there is a special obligation, particularly in light of the times when, boy, the interstate system should be fabulous for our cities, and it's going to increase speed and efficiency, and it's going to reduce, it's going to increase safety, and it did none of those things. In fact, it destroyed our cities. The cities that adopted it the most are irreparably damaged. And those cities like Seattle that just took too long to get there are one of the few bright spots in the country. So I would make an argument that sometimes the judicious appraisal, and maybe not always moving at full speed, there's a place for that, and indeed a responsibility for that from the public sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's obviously mechanisms that ensure accountability that I think are super important.
And I would add, and another critical piece is equity.
Right.
Who are we leaving behind in this process? Right. Because it is so exciting and so enticing. But if you're leaving 30% of the population along, keeping them from catching up, that in itself fails a certain governmental responsibility.
Have you seen instances where government has not been able to keep up and it's done the opposite, where it's actually created negative impact?
Oh, I mean, all the time. I think one of the particular cases in building code. Sometimes the building code is just slow to take on new technologies. On the other hand, there is a responsibility there to make sure things are tested. So it's always a challenge. When do you adopt? When do you say, let's wait? But I think there is an additional responsibility that government has, and it's not always a bad thing.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a space for technology to help government with, like for example, you said highways, they destroyed our cities. Is there a way to do simulation? Nowadays we have 3D models, data-driven design, parametric design, things like that, it may be a relevant discussion for the designers in the room. Where does that responsibility lie for bringing governments along, helping adopt, because we have these tools?
Oh, absolutely.
And help avoid those mistakes.
No, absolutely. And the ability to explain the future, not only shape it, but explain it. In terms of equity, that can be great. Oftentimes that really helps people understand. And the tools that technology brings can be great. But again, just that level of skepticism, which is going to be my theme, should be applied really to kind of all emergent technologies. Just because they all seem like good ideas. It's never like, this is a horrible idea, let's do it. This is a great idea, and it's only in the fullness of time do you realize
Yeah,
that.
it's with good intentions.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Mhm.
We've taken over from the moment.
No.
Shall we?
You guys should, you're allowed to talk to each other, it's fine, I don't have to be handing the mic over to each of you. It's super interesting, just as somebody who's worked with technologists in specifically in emerging technologies like augmented reality, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that oftentimes they're just trying to figure out how to make the thing work and go test it in the world without at all thinking about the consequences. And it's actually kind of terrifying because, for example, AR is something that if we think about how it's going to overlay on our physical spaces, who do you want to be like owning that layer? Who do you want to be having access to that layer? Who do you want, developing what lives on that layer? And oftentimes as a design strategist, as I've asked those questions when working with companies that are developing this technology, the answer is literally, we have not thought of that. And so the assumption going in is that we're going to be continuing to use the model we use today. And if it's a model that's based on essentially surveillance capitalism, as Joel has mentioned, where it's at basically selling your attention to advertisers, we're going to be in big trouble. So I understand your desire to exercise caution. I think the idea of like cities being slower, there is something to that of like the accountability inherent in that, as you've mentioned. Go ahead.
I actually have to completely disagree with you.
Okay.
So augmented reality actually brings us closer together. It's more equitable. So example I can give you is virtual reality or augmented reality. How does a person that can't tell color see the world? You could never describe that. Once you see it, you understand exactly what they're struggling with. You put the virtual reality goggles on, and it's like, oh wow, this wall, I can't see the difference. I know what they're going through, or partially blind person, or a person with aging eyesight, or a person with another eyesight disability, or height, even different height, person in the wheelchair. How do they experience that? Before this augmented reality, virtual reality technology, we had no way of experiencing that, no way of putting ourselves in those people's shoes, and now we can. It just increases our empathy, increases our design ability way more.
So I'm just going to say, I agree with you on that level. I'm not arguing about it lacking use cases, but I do think that oftentimes, and this might be a difference in the space in which you're developing technology and some of the technologists that I've worked with, and it might just speak to kind of like the diversity of how people are approaching this problem space, which is fundamentally problematic, I think, is that there isn't an approach that allows people to kind of think of those necessary use cases, but at the same time think about anticipate the potential unintended consequences that might result from that.
Yeah, I was going to respond to that too. I think, yes, empathy for universal design, great use case, but I think we're talking about a different level. For example, Pokemon Go is a huge rage, still is in some parts, right? How do we think about the way that a private company is monetizing public spaces via AR ads, essentially? Because we know that, so the guy who created this Pokemon, ex-Google guy, it's a game. They've essentially gamified advertising, right? What they're doing is they were essentially modeling new ways of advertising. How do you take geospatial data and understand pedestrian traffic and then basically sell that data to advertisers? So instead of going and finding a Pikachu thing, you're actually pulling up your AR layer showing you an ad for something. And if that ad exists in a public space, do they have the right to do that, right? Those are I think the more hairier problems that we get into, So
that, I'm glad you brought up Pokemon Go, because I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. Now, Joel has talked about, you've talked about loneliness, and now it's not connected to proximity. And it's kind of interesting because I've been thinking a lot about how technology facilitates convenience and efficiency, right? So it's like, you look at things like DoorDash, and what does that do? It kind of like keeps you inside. It's, I think one writer, I can't remember who, referred to it as the shut-in economy. So it's kind of like, what are all the things I can just get delivered to my door so I don't ever have to interact with another human? And so I guess my question is like, how do we resolve that as we're trying to live in close proximity to each other? What do we need to facilitate rather than convenience, and how would we do that?
That's $1 million question. I think so. Our third places have all gone virtual for the most part, right? Like third places have become digital in a lot of ways. So we find that third place community online, where we don't have to show up in the messiness of our humanness. We can control very much how we're being perceived, which is great to have that control. Sometimes you need that. In fact, digital virtual communities have been really huge and amazing for a lot of isolated people who were more, physically isolated. So I think we need to just be aware of where our third places are. I think we need to, in our, I think that there's an imperative for developers, especially, to think about how they're developing public spaces. There's an imperative for developers to make sure they're partnering with government and urban planners to think about how those spaces are being programmed. I think the model of just building and selling buildings in our urban areas is going to start to become less and less feasible. Because the ways that we actually program spaces is going to become the market differentiator more than just the actual physicalness of the space. So I think programming is really huge. I think giving a lot of attention for those who are responsible for the design, building, and management of built environments. Who are the people we're putting in these spaces, right? Are these people who are, just kind of going to stay heads down? Are we replacing reception desks with screens on walls for wayfinding? How are we thinking about, hospitality and F&B spaces and who's in those spaces and what kind of programming goes into? I think these are the things I think for architects especially are really, really critical. I think that there's a huge imperative for architects to think about not just the physicalness of the space, the hardware of the space, but also the software of the space. What's happening in there? What do the interactions look like? What kinds of culture are you cultivating? What kind of people and human beings are you planting? Those are critical questions. That's not quite the answer. It's a lot more, but I think it's a good place to start.
I'm just going to jump in. From a technological perspective, we are changing at an obscenely fast rate, and yet from a human being perspective, we haven't changed really at all in 50,000 years in terms of what we need.
It's like we have new software, but we're still running on the old hardware.
We're absolutely running on 1.0 hardware, and that hardware, both in terms of physical as well as psychic well-being, requires us to move rapidly for about 30 minutes a day at least, and it requires that we have meaningful social interaction. And to a significant degree, technological improvements and improvements have eliminated both of those critical human needs. So again, what we think we want and what we need are often two different things, and we must be careful not to lose one for the other.
So two things. One is real estate as a service, and how do you design that? I'm curious to find out from designers in the room. And another thing to comment on that, I think we're just too comfortable. We need to step outside, be a little bit uncomfortable, walk a little in the rain, maybe forget your phone in your house once in a while and ask for directions. Yeah, be uncomfortable for, 10 minutes of the day. Start there.
Yeah, I 100% talk to people, damn it. Like seriously, just say hi to a stranger, see how it goes, and be willing to walk through that discomfort. Like, imagine if we got 20% of the city to just talk to a stranger on a daily basis, how transformative that would be. I think that'd be huge. I was at a bar, and it's become a habit, and I always look around and see how many people are looking at phones. It's insane to me, like 95% of people, and I should probably I'm gonna document this, actually make it scientifically rigorous, but I look around, everyone's staring at a freaking phone, and it's like, we've lost that third space, and the connection that third space affords us as human beings to meet that need that we have for actual connection, so anyways.
Great, so I think it would be excellent to open it up to some questions. Yes?
Yeah, a lot of y'all have talked about how you make an unbiased system, but I'm interested to hear more about how you plan to do that with data that's been collected as a means for an end from an imperfect past. And we know that there's been algorithms to determine who gets parole, for example, that's based on information that says you put a minority into a racist society and limits their access to opportunity, they're likely to reoffend, and we're building buildings based on climate data from the past when we know that 50-year floods are happening every 10 years. So how do you plan to use that information to design for a better future?
Did everyone hear the question? Just to sum it up, how do we now correct for basically decisions that are based on historical data that is now rendered imperfect?
I don't have the answer. Oh man, there are. So I was just.
There are whole books on this.
Yeah, it's a massive issue. In fact, I was at a AI summit at Amazon with the Embassy of Finland last week, and they were talking about this. Like, this is one of the hugest issues that the AI community, data community at large, is trying to crack. And there's a lot of different ideas about how to do it. No one has the answer, right? There's no silver bullet. I think representation is the number one thing. And it starts there, ends there. Like, that's got to be kind of the gold standard. And then until we can figure that out, like, we shouldn't be having other conversations in my mind.
Yeah, extend your training data. Like, essentially, like, widen the data set that you are collecting from to begin with, and acknowledge the biases that might be inherent, so that you know that there should not be decisions made on the types of data that might have a different future trajectory than they've had. You don't want to make hiring decisions that rule out women because women haven't been hired at a company, right? So it's, yeah.
I'd like just to make a small plug for human judgment and democracy. I think we sometimes overestimate what can be produced by algorithm, and that there is a great place for just solid brain thinking, the old school kind.
This is true, but it's interesting. Like, I remember I was watching a panel, and Shankar Narayan, who used to work for the ACLU, was on that panel, and he was like, we have to acknowledge that potentially one is not better than the other. So if you take the example of parole, it could be that AI reinforces the wrong thing, which is based on proxy data, etc. Things like race, which shouldn't even be under consideration. Or you could get a terrible judge who is by themselves racist. And so the key is to hold basically two ideas in your head at the same time and be able to understand, like, there is a place for human judgment, there is a place for computational judgment.
There's actually also a flip side, a positive side, when machine judges you. So back to our example of running the red light, if machine sees a car running a red light, it will issue you a ticket regardless of what race, what nationality, where you're from, you just plain old get a ticket because you broke the law. So sometimes if we extend the power of, if we have the right laws in place, then again that brings a discussion about morality and laws and what are the laws. But if we work with the current laws that we have, and if we have unbiased enforcement of that, maybe that's not such a bad idea, and that's a flip side of unbiased.
I think you had a question back there.
So I want to extrapolate on this theme of equity and democracy in the decision-making process for cities. My colleagues are here with me. We work on the community engagement side for public infrastructure projects, might be SDOT, Sound Transit, WashDOT, other public utilities. And there are all these great tools in terms for community engagement and technological assets, but 99 times out of 100, the scopes of work that we get to do the community engagement side never, ever, ever has enough money to do entirely equitable work. And we might have really great partners, our prime AEC partners on a project that philosophically value that element of equity and inclusion in the decision making, but it's just like we're so far along in the process, it's kind of too late to make that advocacy, or we might be on an on-call contract, so we've got a pipeline bursting in Bellevue, we just have to go out. And really, the decision-making process so often just kind of values people, particularly here who are affluent, who go to public meetings. So, we come kicking and screaming about equity, equity, equity. We can't get technological tools because we're just happy if we can get flyers out in Korean or Somali or Ukrainian in a given project area. So I'd love to hear from those of you on the design side, how can we collectively make a really compelling and aggressive case for more funding and more support that's really going to fulfill policy goals around equity that are addressing both functionality, the cultural inclusivity of people, and really moving people socioeconomically in their lives.
This is a question that's near and dear to my heart, and in many respects transcends just basic technology. We certainly know that in the standard public meeting forum where you stand up in front of an audience, a sizable percentage of the population would, not figuratively, would literally die than go in front of people and speak. And those are people with full English skills and are comfortably culturally. So that is a terrible model. Now we have found that using technology, using the basic internet, not sophisticated technology, just polling, doing virtual town halls, those kinds of things are great. You're able to expand your catchment, you're able to really expand your involvement, you're able to get input that's not only broader but faster, to your point. The challenge there is, well, twofold. One is, does everybody have access to that technology? And again, there's certainly a wealth and cultural divide there. But even more critically, if you're a single mom working 3 jobs, you're probably not worried about land use decisions that aren't going to affect anybody for 50 years. And so how you help, and again, this is partly a technological question, it's partly a cultural question, how do you connect with people in a broad and equitable way that is meaningful and respectful of their time? I think there's a technological answer there, but I'm not sure it's just a technological answer.
Yeah, I don't have the answer. It's not my expertise, but I would say, just for the architects in the room, I would implore you, and I would say architects, we even have an ethical imperative to engage the community even before the process of design, so that community engagement isn't happening after the design's been done and we're going through permitting and design review. If you are able to engage the community and co-create with them through the design process, by the time it gets to this team, it'll be so much better and easier. And so I would implore you to do that, and not to, shield yourself from that and the potential community ramifications and their voice and what they may be asking of you. So.
I'll add to that, and I think we have to expand the conversation from equity to allyship as well. So who are your allies in the community? Reach out to them, connect with them, so that it doesn't just preaching to the choir or we support each other, but it goes beyond seeking support from other maybe majority organizations, other organizations who have a bigger funding budget that extend a helping hand, or hey, can you be my ally, or I really need the support on this one. And I think it's okay to start taking the conversation there now.
Yes.
Oh, hi, sorry, I didn't see you.
To follow up on this vein of discussion, I guess I'd like to know, because I see marginalized communities, and we haven't even talked about most of them. They're in the homeless shelter. Have you gone down, or your groups like for artificial intelligence? I mean, how do you include people in homeless shelters? Chronically mentally ill individuals should be included in AI. And Anna, no offense, but it's very important to understand people with disabilities. Empathy for those people doesn't come with a sit-down session of seeing what their world is like, because you can walk out of that world. So that was a great example, but it was a very bad example of building empathy for the experience of persons with disabilities. It plain doesn't work, and that's been proven in excuse me, lots of research models. And I'm not faulting you for that. You're not in that world. You don't understand that whole kind of concept for people with disabilities. You haven't done research on it, and that's my point. It's white privilege only. It's able-minded privilege, it's able-bodied privilege, and it's architectural and IQ privilege, if you will. And those are the folks who are designing the artificial intelligence. And you've got a privilege and never think, I loved your 15 circles, all right? There's 25 circles of people who will be affected by what you do, and you don't even necessarily know they exist. And that's kind of what I'd like to address of artificial intelligence or augmented reality. When you're developing those tools, do you go talk to chronically mentally ill people or people who are currently incarcerated? Because they will be affected by what you develop. I think that was your point. You start with, who is this going to affect? And anyway, that was, I don't know how you do that currently, or is that part of your work ethic in development of artificial intelligence and augmented reality, to start with, who are you going to affect? Not just the circle of your allies and people that you know. It's the people you don't know that you often wind up affecting.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, unless any of you want to address that,
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I'm your 20th century guy. There is an amazing documentary / propaganda piece that you can find on YouTube, produced in the 1950s, called The Road Ahead. And it describes the transportation system of the future. It's narrated by Walter Cronkite, no less. And it's all about the coming interstate system and how glorious it's going to be, how it's going to reduce congestion, increase safety. None of that is true. But what it did produce was horrific impacts on our African American community. Not only destroy by bisecting these neighborhoods, but white flight left many of these communities behind. And again, irreparably. I mean, to a degree that we will never be able to repair those places. And that's just one example of something that you never would have thought through. I mean, if you scratch your head, it's a transportation system, it's going to be great. To your point, it is really hard, and I think the onus is especially heavy on government to really think about who is going to be left behind in this brave new 21st century.
So if I find this discussion really interesting because there was just a piece in the New York Times the other day about affordability and building, right? And if you're like thinking about the root cause for some of these equity problems, it was kind of interesting. There were advocates for basically increasing density in this article who took their responsibility as speaking for the people who aren't there yet. So it's kind of like, how can we not only represent marginalized people within the community now, but people who are not even in that community yet, in order to essentially try to resolve some of these eventual societal problems by making the right decisions now. And I'm not sure how to do that.
That is the issue, yes.
Should we take your question? Okay, wait, let me see what time it is. It's 6:52, so yeah, we have a few more minutes. So we could probably take one or two more.
I'll be quick, yeah. All three of you make design decisions in your everyday job or work. How do you guys make these decisions and decide whether or not like the long-term impact is more important than the short-term impact, or whether the short-term impact is more important than the long-term? Because I think about like light rail to Linwood, 2040, and that sounds like a long ways away. But it impacts all of us on our commutes to work today and tomorrow and the next day with the construction. So I'm just wondering how all of you make decisions and try to justify short-term impact versus long-term impact.
From the City of Seattle side, certainly all of our decisions theoretically are drawn from the comprehensive plan, which is a guiding document for the future, and theoretically all of the decisions, even big and small, are drawn from that. But the reality is that we often have very conflicting issues when it comes to decision making. Livability versus mobility is one that we face every single day. At the macro scale and right down to the micro scale. And that takes a huge amount of judgment. It takes learning from examples of the past, but it also, just here tonight, you're learning about the future, and then how do you build all of that information in. So it is not simple.
So I'm in an interesting position because I'm not an architect. I don't design things. As a researcher, I'm in a position of informing the decision making. I don't typically get to make the decision. So I take it upon myself to just constantly be pushing for more and more in terms of what's being considered, in terms of the variables that are being weighed, the time horizons that we're thinking about. It's my job to equip decision makers with as much information as possible, so that they can make the most informed decision possible, but also to be a bit of I consider myself a corporate heterodox in the sense that I often promote and advocate for decisions that may not be in the best interest of the enterprise, but for the end user, right? And so to be that internal, kind of red team, if you will, where we're constantly poking, provoking, and advocating for, issues that maybe aren't going to be financially lucrative, but decisions that ultimately will be best for the end user in some way. So again, the way you go about that and how you come to that conclusion looks different in every instance. But I do think that, again, if designers are able to work with researchers and cross-functional, cross-disciplinary teams to incorporate as much perspective as possible, especially the perspective of the people who maybe they don't know, that's critical. That's like the first step.
Yeah, and for us, on the real estate side, when we look into development decision, it's data-driven decision making. So we call them IW assessment. So understanding how is our space used. So we have a big department that looks into future of a workplace. What is Generation Z is going to be like? How will they like to work? And a big part of that work. Do they want to work from home? Do they want to? Is it going to be more of a gig type situation where there's no full-time positions, that it's more like an entrepreneurial style? How do we create a workplace for that type of workforce that is coming into us, into the company? How do we retain them? How do we grow them? Another discussion that we just recently had as well is how it's not going to be a career ladder or a lattice, that it's going to be a themed career. If you have a data-driven career, or if you have an AI career in artificial intelligence or augmented reality, how do you build that theme for yourself? And for us, how do we respond with a space, a place to facilitate that kind of work?
Great. Well, sorry.
If I could just add one more quick note on this, I think, so a lot of us heard like human-centered design or user-centered design. I think we need like more ecological approaches to design, where it's not just about the person or the human, but the ecological impact, the system's impact. So I think broadening our view in that regard too, like I think human-centered design is probably seen its day.
Well, thank you, and if you still have questions, the panelists will be hanging around for a little bit to speak to all of you. Thanks so much for coming, and I don't know if Kim, you had anything to add?
Oh, I just wanted to thank everyone once again for spending your evening with us. I know it was a beautiful evening, so thanks for joining us indoors. We do programs like these kind of once a quarter, and they correspond to the exhibits going on in our space. And we're really excited about an exhibit coming up this summer called When Seattle Shakes. So if you like geology, if you like earthquakes, if you liked unreinforced masonry, and you think you want to be a part of, you know, a group of volunteers that meet once a month and come up with, you know, fun programming, let me know. We'd love to have you on board. So that's it. And once again, a big round of applause for our panelists.